Right, hi. I had this idea in the small hours about my kids are learning, well, one of my kids is starting to learn guitar or wants to play guitar. So I always had this idea that I would do the sort of five basic principles that make you sound better than you are when if you're playing particularly kind of hard rock, heavy metal. And then last night I got to thinking about doing that. So I've been meaning to do something on that just for fun. And then I thought, well, actually, they're not a million miles away from the five principles of effective design as practiced by me. So they might not be the kind of universal five rules of effective design, but it's what I do. And I thought actually they kind of match up together. So just for fun, here is the some principles of effective design through the medium of hard rock and heavy metal guitar techniques, and then we'll see what happens. Right. So number one is simplification. Simplification means in terms of design, if I talk about simplification in terms of design, it's about looking at a topic or a subject or the jargon or a brief or whatever and stripping it back to the kind of core principles. What actually is going on with a design or an idea or a concept when you take away all the jargon, you take away everything that's related to, whatever it is you're actually talking about, the sort of mechanics, if you're doing something on washing powder, what happens if you take all the washing powder words out of it? What are you left with? What are you actually trying to do? What are you actually trying to say? And going through that practice of looking at a brief and stripping away all the unnecessary detail to get to the core of what it's all about, and then rebuilding it from there I find tends to be a really helpful exercise. You don't always have to do it, but sometimes it is really effective to just kind of strip back and say, well, what am I actually talking about? And where can I again go and find stuff that mirrors that, in a different, maybe a totally different discipline, maybe a totally different market. And sometimes that can be quite helpful because you're seeing solutions to stuff in places you wouldn't have normally looked, and it stops you from just copying what's gone before. In terms of rock and metal, simplification means instead of when we play a guitar, we play chords, like a G, a D, and a C or whatever. That sounds fine, but as soon as you put any overdrive or distortion on that, it begins to sound a bit muddy and a little bit Josh Homme, and it all gets dead noisy, and it's not particularly nice. So one of the first principles of playing hard rock guitar is stripping down. It's called a power chord, and it's stripping down a chord to its basic root note, and then a kind of, I think it's a third above it, but it's basically one string up, two frets up. So instead of having a G, a D, and a C, you kind of go. So you strip those chords back to their kind of basic roots, and it gives you a much cleaner sound. Right, so related to simplification, I guess, is what we'll call reservation, which means kind of, you see it particularly with, you see it a lot with AI stuff. You see it a lot in coins at the moment. Everything piled in, everything that can go into a design goes into a design, and it's a massive showcase of technique and stuff all over the place. Too much going on, too many unnecessary things to sort of prove a point. As a designer, you do not have to use every pencil. You do not have to show the client that you're using every pencil. You're like an airline pilot. You're not being paid to push every button. You're being paid to push the right button at the right time, or to use the right tool at the right time. And so being reserved in terms of design means kind of, keeping some stuff back, being happy that maybe the viewer doesn't automatically see what you are saying with your visual language, but that thing is there anyway. That is the choices you make, the creative choices you make, are inherent in the design. They don't have to be overt. They don't have to be like shouting out at the viewer. It is powerful enough for the design that they are there, and that they they make effective design quietly, and they do it in a way that kind of speaks a message without having to tell everybody everything that's going on. In terms of coin design, you see it with picture something on a coin, and then the words around the coin describe the thing that's in the middle of the coin. It's like, you don't need to do that. It's fine. If it's a collectible piece like a Star Wars coin, for example, then why does it have to say Star Wars around it? It's going to be in packaging. That packaging will say Star Wars. It's a kind of pretty ubiquitous IP that everybody knows. So why not? Your design language can be a little bit more subtle, and a little bit more covert, and a little bit more reserved, because you don't need to shout everything out all the time. So in terms of guitar, once we've got our power chords, and we've simplified our kind of the structure of the notes we're playing to keep them a bit cleaner, so they kind of cut through a little bit more. Being reserved in terms of this, we're talking about what's called palm muting. So if I'm playing, it's all, it's fine, but as soon as if we start to palm mute, then we're kind of deadening the sound. So what I'm doing, if you can see, palm muting is I'm putting my hand just lightly on the bridge, right at the back. Now this is a tremolo bridge, so what I don't want to do is push too hard, because otherwise it will bend the strings out of tune. So it's just really light, and it gives me that. It holds the sound back a little bit, and that you will see in pretty much every kind of hard rock, certainly heavy metal band that goes on. The palm muting is one of the kind of core techniques for keeping everything under control and holding stuff back, so that when you do let something sing, it sticks out a bit. The same with design. If you hold some stuff back, then when you do want to make a point, it's much clearer and it's much more effective. So kind of. So you can, by palm muting some of the notes, as soon as you get to one that rings out, it makes a difference. It sounds different. It creates a different kind of texture in the song, and it's exactly the same with design. Hold something back, be reserved, so that when you want to sing out, you can make a real sort of show of it. Okay, so kind of related to, so we've simplified, we've reserved, so we've held some stuff back, we're keeping everything very diplomatic, very clean, very sort of subtle-ish. That doesn't really work, does it, subtle? But the flip side of that is when you want to make a real point, when you want to focus and concentrate and make a real noise about something. And that is that can be in terms of the design you're actually doing. It can also be in terms of the way you work. So you would call it in video games, it's called the crunch, isn't it? Or in graphic design, it's called the crunch, where everything kind of powers into a kind of razor sharp focus, and everybody kind of gets behind something and pushes it out. And in terms of rock guitar techniques, this is probably one of the hardest ones, which is it's called a harmonic squeal, if you like. And what it involves doing is using so you've got your plectrum, and what you want to do is try and catch the string when you pluck it with the pad of your thumb to make the most heavy metal sound in the world. So that kind of focus, that what you're doing is you're digging in, you're clipping the string with the pad of that thumb to make that kind of, make that sort of squeal. And that's the kind of opposite to me of the palm muting. It's the opposite of the reservation. It's like suddenly we're going to go all in, push all the focus in, and make something really sing out and make it kind of shriek in the middle of it, you know, kind of, so when you get a palm muted sort of. It really sings out in the middle of those palm muted notes. And that's the same with design, you know, and design process as well as design kind of decoration, that sometimes everything has to focus in, and, you know, being reserved and holding stuff back allows you to kind of push then something that really sings out in the middle of everything else and makes a huge noise and captures everybody's attention. Okay, fourth principle of effective design as illustrated through rock guitar techniques, and it's starting to get a bit esoteric now. Is esoteric the word? Or a bit kind of ambiguous and a little bit conceptual. So if you kind of think about design is a juggling act, and at one end you've got your client, so your client's up here making all these noises and demanding you do stuff and dictating where a particular brief or a particular idea is going to go. So your client is kind of hitting the note, and they might be like, you know, it might be cheerful, or it might be kind of maybe something more serious. Or it might be something that's really slow and plodding and quite kind of lacking in energy. Or it might be something much faster and energetic. But your client is up here dictating the notes, and you're down the other end kind of working with that. So guitar playing is very much about a two-handed thing. So, you know, what this hand is doing is just as important as what this hand is doing. This hand might be calling the notes and calling the shots, but it's this hand that decides whether something is reserved or reserved or kind of sings out. And what we tend to forget about is there tends to be like designer over here and client over here, and we forget about all this stuff in the middle. That there is a breadth of communication between what these guys are doing and what you're doing over here. And that sometimes, we forget, and bridging that gap brings us to new places altogether. So what happens if, the designer becomes more up towards the client end, or the client becomes more up towards the designer? This is all very conceptual, but I'm just doing this for fun. So take from it what you will. So in terms of guitar playing, this brings us to another classic guitar technique, which is the slide. So we take the pick, and you're just going to want to run the pick down the strings. Or alternatively, you can, this is very Eddie Van Halen, basic Eddie Van Halen stuff, is run your fingers up the strings. One thing Eddie Van Halen also used to do was use his pick to kind of get a bit of like a half squeal, and then run it down the strings. To get this kind of harmonic change as he went up, which is really nice. So don't forget that there's always a gap between designer and client, because that is the point. If the client was able to do all this as well, they wouldn't need the designer. This is kind of, it's the problem with AI, isn't it? The left hand suddenly starts thinking it's also a right hand. So remember the gap between you. And sometimes it's important to have that distance. Sometimes it's important to change that distance and come, sometimes you need synergy between designer and client, and you need to be working with a very sort of clear avenue ahead. Sometimes you want to be able to step back and do something different. Like I said, it's a bit of a stretch connecting design to electric guitar, but we are where we are. We've only got one more left, so let's push on through. Okay, we are at the end, the final slightly odd and possibly not very useful connection between heavy rock guitar playing and design process is here, and it is resonance, one of my favourite words. Designs must resonate. That means that when people look at it, when people look at a design, they look at your work and they look at it in the context in which you are presenting it, that it should resonate with them, that it should stir something within them. And I always take the idea of resonance to be that it's not just they look at it and go, oh yeah, I get it, and that's what it's all about. Resonance is something more instinctive, that it's that stuff you put in the design, even if it isn't overtly obvious that it is related to the topic you're designing for, that it still touches the viewer in some ways. And I always think that whatever you put into a design should be at the core of it. So sometimes my students they'll do design and they'll come up with a full page of font choices. This was one of my favourite illustrations of this. Pages and pages and pages of ever so slightly different fonts. Totally useless, doesn't make a blind bit of difference. The client is not going to, nobody's going to care whether the serifs are slightly bigger on one font than on the other. But what does matter is why you've chosen a particular, there should be a rationale for choosing a particular type of font, for example. So, is it a heavy block font? Is it a thin serif font? Is it italic? Is it wacky and wonderful? Is it very traditional. You know, there should be a rationale for why you've picked that, and beyond that rationale, all the tweaks and mucking about doesn't really, well, maybe it matters, but there's a question to ask yourself there: is there value in me doing all those, you know, iterations of a font? If the core rationale for putting it in there is right, then when people look at it, it will resonate with them. It will impact them. They will understand the design instinctively, and it will communicate its message effectively. In terms of heavy rock guitar, what we're talking about really is harmonics. So to make a harmonic, you're with your left hand, and you're kind of plucking a string, and you're not pressing down on the fret, you're just lightly touching it where it meets one of the frets, and there's certain points on the fretboard where this will work better than others. So it's another very, very Eddie Van Halen technique, but it's a very common one. Also do it by fretting. What Eddie Van Halen used to do quite a lot was fret a chord and then hit the harmonics further up the fret. So we've just got a kind of, you know, E-shaped chord here. So John Sykes used it a lot. Used this technique a lot with Whitesnake. And it's just resonance, so it's just getting the guitar strings to kind of sing in a harmonic. Which of course you can combine then with your Floyd Rose to get these nice kind of really Van Halen sort of noises. So there we have it, the 5 principles of effective design: simplification, reservation, what were the other ones? There was harmonic resonance, there was bridging the gap between client and designer, and the last one was crunch, squeal, focus, and singing out above the crowd. Through the medium of heavy rock guitar. I'm not sure whether that's worth it. I'm going to patch this video together and see if it sounds as stupid as it feels. But I hope it was fun and inspires you to pick up your own guitar or your own pencils and do something fun.